My name is Josh Pugh, and I will be covering Chapter 11 of the Griffin textbook, which is entitled Traditional Leadership Approaches. I found this content very interesting. I'm always interested on what makes a good leader, what traits, behaviors, or characteristics make up a good leader, so I hope this content is intriguing to you as it was to me as I read it. Next slide. The nature of leadership. Leadership is both a process and a property. Now, the process of leadership is the actual doing of the influence to the group. Are you showing leadership and coordinating activities for your group members to meet a goal? Leadership as a property is the characteristics that you yourself have as a leader, and it's perceived to use such influence successfully. Leadership and management are often used simultaneously, but in actuality they're slightly different. They're related, but they are not the same. Leadership isn't forced, it's rather earned or displayed, and I would say is more people focused, whereas in management is more formal and you coordinate results and it's intent to accomplish a goal. Leaders, I'm sure y'all know leaders, they're more people focused. They consider the people, subordinates, group members around them, and a manager can sometimes be so focused on accomplishing a task or a goal that they can appear more rigid and are so more worried more about results than anything else. But what you want to have is be a manager but also display leadership characteristics. Next slide. Early approaches to leadership. Now these two approaches are both trait and behavioral. Now trait approach is basically the physical traits and psychological traits that make up a leader. I think of the NFL Combine. When you look at, say, the Denver Broncos want to draft a quarterback, they look at the height of that person. The weight, is he a person of integrity? Does he have confidence? Does he know the playbook? These are all traits approach to leadership where coaches look at these quarterbacks to decide, can they lead our franchise? Do they have these traits to display that? Whereas in the behavioral approach to leadership looks at the actual doing or behavior of leadership, and it's just a method of measuring leadership. Now there was two studies, both the Michigan and the Ohio State. The Michigan focused on job-centered versus employee-centered behavior. They found that employee-centered behavior was the most effective, and the difference between the two is like it sounds. The leader was more job-centered, more focused on goals, tasks, getting things done, being effective in that way. Employee-centered was focused on that, but it had a heavy emphasis on the subordinates and just through the intention of the human aspects of what it means to be a leader. And the consideration versus initiating structure behavior from Ohio State. So the consideration is the leader is concerned with the subordinates' feelings and respects their ideas. It's based on mutual respect, trust, and one-on-one communication. Where initiating structure is more rigid and you have clearly defined roles between leader and subordinate. You have specific channels of communication, and if you don't follow those channels, it's looked in a negative light. So those are the two different studies that were done and regarding behavioral, and just looked at what was most effective. Next slide. The leadership grid. So basically this looks at the concern for production against the concern for people. You can have all these different 5 types that are listed in this grid. Maybe you have, as a leader, you have concern for people, but concern for production is low. So you're a country club management, meaning you're more focused on your people under you and creating a acceptable environment rather than getting the task done at a high level. But what you want is that sweet spot, and which is called team management, and you do this through the organization trains its managers using organizational development techniques to organize, to have them a concern for production, but also a high concern for people, because you need both to be an effective leader. Next slide. Situational leadership models. I'll go over the LPC theory, the path goal theory, Vroom's decision to tree approach. Those are the 3 I will go through the next few slides. There's also the Tannenbaum and Schmidt's leadership continuum, which basically looks at as you go down the line and you go less and less authority and more freedom for your subordinates, the different style of leadership develops in the model. So whether it's, as you go down the line and get more freedom to the subordinates, you would consult them more or delegate them more. If you're not in more boss-centered leadership, you tell them what you want to do, you sell them an idea, and you kind of just try to get them on board. So those are kind of the differentiators that I found very interesting from this textbook. Next slide, please. The LPC theory of leadership basically looks at the task motivation versus the relationship motivation. And they did this through the LPC scale. Now, I didn't know this, but LPC stands for least preferred coworker. So basically, as a leader, you identify your least preferred coworker, and you go through the series of 16 scales between like pleasant and unpleasant, helpful and unhelpful, and you pick a number between the two. And in the end, the scale says more about the leader than the LPC because you identify the personality traits that you desire and that makes a difference and that you want your subordinates to display. So you might identify your least preferred coworker at home. Don't say the name out loud. You're called to love them. So just do that. I'm just kidding, of course. But I just thought that was very funny, and I didn't know what LPC stand for until this chapter. It also talked about situational favorableness and how leaders can look at their relations with the leader and the member, the structure, the task structure, and the leader position power. So you look at these and decide as a leader, is this favorable for me or not? And you make a decision on that. And then you find that leader situation match. And if it's not how you want it to be an effective leader, you job engineer, which is you change the situation. So if you don't have a good leader-member relationship, spend more time with your subordinates. Try to find out what areas you need to grow in to make your situation favorable. So next slide. Path goal theory of leadership. It is just like it sounds, and it's defined as the effective leaders clarify the behavior, the paths that will lead to the desired goals. So what behavior will get the desired goals of me as a leader? And these behaviors include directive, supportive, participative, and achievement-oriented. And there, of course, there's situational factors when you want to look at which one you want to do, and you got to look at the personal characteristics of the subordinates and the characteristics of the environment, and you kind of, depending on those two, make a decision what kind of behavior you want to display. So let's say you have a subordinate who wants to take their job under their own control. They want to have some say in where we're going as a group. The directive might not be the most effective because maybe participative, because the leader takes the group member into account when they're making these decisions and displaying these behaviors. So it's just defining that situational factor on what that leader behavior should display. So the path to the goal. Next slide. Vroom's decision tree approach. It was very interesting. Basically, you just ask questions, and when in the end you get to make a decision whether to decide, delegate, consult as a group, consult individually, or facilitate. So what it basically is ultimately you're answering the question of how much subordinate participation should be allowed. You're asking the question. So let's say the first one, which is decision significance. Is it high or is it low? And you go to the next one. Importance of commitment. Is it high or is it low? If the decision significance is high and the importance of commitment is low, maybe you should just consult as a group, or maybe you should just decide. So there's multiple options as you go down these trees, these branches. So I found that very interesting as well. So those are the three approaches that you found that I found in the textbook. Next slide. And the question I want you to consider is, think about a leader you have had in the past 5 years. This can be a manager, a boss, a teacher, a pastor, etc. And you explain why this leader excelled, describing his or her personality and behavior traits. So if you can answer that question for me, I'm sure you've had influential leaders in the past that you believe have both personality and behavioral traits that made him or her a great leader. So if you can answer that question for me, that would be great, and I think that kind of breeds the discussion. I hope that you enjoyed both the traits, the behavior, and the three different approaches to leadership. Thank you all for listening to me, and I look forward to listening to y'all as well as we go through the chapter.